The first time Martha Wells walked into Calico Creek, she walked in alone, which told everyone who looked twice at her exactly the kind of woman she was. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was the kind of place that ate soft people whole and spat out their bones before supper time. The wind came down off the plains like something personal, like the land itself had decided to make a point, and the dust that followed it painted every surface in the same flat ochre that coated the back of your throat and the inside of your lungs until you forgot what clean air had ever tasted like. Calico Creek sat at the edge of a dried-up bend in a creek that had given the town its name and then promptly vanished, as if even the water had thought better of staying. There were two saloons, a general store, a livery, a blacksmith, a church that leaned 7 degrees east, and enough trouble between all of those establishments to keep the small jail occupied every Saturday night without fail. Martha Wells arrived on a Wednesday, driving her own wagon, her own 2 mules, and pulling a look on her face that suggested she had already made up her mind about every single person who might have the nerve to stare at her. Several people did stare. Martha did not appear to notice or care. She had a canvas-covered load in the wagon bed, a worn leather satchel on the seat beside her, and hands on the reins that told a story her mouth never would, at least not to strangers and not without a reason. Those hands. Anyone who looked at them long enough would have seen the truth of the woman before she said a single word. They were brown from the sun, the knuckles slightly swollen from cold mornings and hard work. The skin thickened along the palm and across the first joints of her fingers into a topography of small, honest scars and earned calluses. The kind of hands that belonged to a woman who had split her own firewood, mended her own fences, pulled her own calves, and buried her own dead without asking anyone to do any of it for her. Martha Wells was 31 years old in the spring of 1878, and every one of those years had left something behind on the surface of her. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, set the brake, and climbed down with the practiced ease of a woman who did not need help and had stopped expecting it so long ago she no longer remembered missing it. She tied the mules to the post, checked their water with a brief, expert look, and then went inside. Josiah Pruitt ran the general store, and he was the sort of man who collected information about new arrivals the way some men collected coins, eagerly, compulsively, and with a sense that possession equaled power. He put on his most welcoming face when Martha pushed through the door, a face that said welcome and also tell me everything simultaneously, which was a complicated expression to hold. Martha set a list on the counter without preamble. "I will need all of this," she said. "I have coin. I would prefer not to barter today, but I have it available if your stock is low." Josiah glanced at the list. It was substantial. Flour, salt, beans, cornmeal, lamp oil, wire, hinges, 2 blocks of salt for the cattle, a length of rope, a small parcel of seed. "You setting up somewhere nearby?" he asked, which was as subtle as he ever managed. 12 miles northwest," she said. "The Hatcher land." Josiah paused in his reading of the list. "The Hatcher place has been empty going on 4 years. "I am aware of that," Martha said. "I purchased it legally." "You may verify that at the land office in Amarillo if you have a particular need to confirm it." Josiah did not have the nerve to tell her that he did have that particular need, so instead he began pulling goods from his shelves. "You running it alone?" he asked, which he intended to sound conversational and which came out sounding exactly like what it was, which was astonishment lightly dressed as small talk. Martha looked at him with dark brown eyes that were not unkind, but were absolutely, utterly patient in the way a woman's eyes get patient when she has answered this question or some version of it many times before, and has long since stopped being surprised by it. "Yes," she said, without elaboration. She paid in coin, arranged to have the heavier supplies loaded into her wagon, thanked Josiah with a courtesy that was genuine but contained, and left. Josiah watched her go and then turned to the two men sitting near the potbelly stove at the back of the store who had heard every word of the exchange, and said, "Well." Neither of the men offered a response to this, because there did not seem to be an adequate one. Martha Wells drove the 12 miles back to the Hatcher place, her place, through the afternoon heat, and when she arrived she unloaded her own supplies, stabled her own mules, and then stood in the yard of the small, weathered house with the plainest expression a woman can wear, the expression of a person taking genuine stock of what they have and what needs to be done, and she was not discouraged by it. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. She rolled up her sleeves and got started. She had come from Kansas, originally. She had married at 19 to a man named Robert Wells, who was not a bad man but was not a strong one, and who had tried his honest best for 8 years before a fever took him in the summer of 1875, leaving Martha with a small farm, 2 children, and debts that had required her to sell the farm. Her children, Daniel, who was 12 now, and Clara, who was 10, were staying with Martha's sister in Abilene while Martha got the land ready. That was the plan. Get the land ready, bring them down, build something that would last. She had not come to Texas looking for anything except room to build that something, and she had chosen the Panhandle because the land was cheap enough to be bought and the sky was wide enough to think straight under. She had not come looking for a man. She would have said this plainly, cheerfully even if anyone had asked, because it was true, and because she had nothing to apologize for in its truth. She had earned every callus on her hands and she was not looking for soft. She had tried soft, in small ways, in the 8 years of her marriage and the 3 years since, and soft things broke in the Panhandle. She needed what she needed, and she had long since made peace with providing it for herself. The spring passed in a cycle of work that was honest and satisfying in the way that purely physical labor can be satisfying when the person doing it has chosen it freely. Martha repaired the fence line around the property's 40 acres, set new posts where the old ones had rotted, and stretched wire until her palms bled and then healed and hardened again. She replastered the interior walls of the house, repaired the roof where it had buckled under 4 years of neglect, dug out the well, which had partially collapsed, and coaxed it back into usefulness with 3 days of patient work and a great deal of creative profanity, she said only when she was certain no one could hear. She broke a section of the south field and planted it with winter wheat, working behind one of her mules with a borrowed plow she had traded 2 weeks of labor from Josiah Pruitt's store to obtain. She met her neighbors gradually. The Garfield family was 2 miles to the east, a married couple in their 40s with a grown son, and they were quiet, careful people who minded their own and expected others to do the same, which meant they and Martha got along well from the start. An older Mexican man named Hector Rios ran a small goat operation 3 miles south, and he shared his technical knowledge of the local soil and water tables with Martha when she came to ask for it, which she did plainly and without embarrassment, because she knew what she didn't know and had never been ashamed of that. Hector Rios taught her where the hardpan ran under the topsoil and where it didn't, and Martha filed that knowledge away with the rest of the practical information she was building her life from. And then there was the ranch. The Sheridan operation was the largest working property within 20 miles, roughly 4,000 acres that ran north and west of Calico Creek, and which was known throughout the region primarily because it was well run. There was no dramatic story attached to it, no legend, no scandal. The Sheridan Ranch was known for producing good cattle, treating its hands fairly, and keeping its fences mended. Benjamin Sheridan had inherited it from his father 7 years ago when he was 26, and had grown it steadily since without cutting corners or breaking anybody who hadn't needed breaking. Martha had heard his name 3 or 4 times before she ever saw his face. Josiah Pruitt mentioned him. Benjamin Sheridan had an ongoing account at the store that was always settled on time. Hector Rios mentioned him. Benjamin Sheridan had once helped Hector track down a stolen animal over a weekend when it would have been easier to do nothing, and Hector remembered things like that. Even the Garfields, who were sparing with words generally, described him as a decent man, which from the Garfields was practically a glowing endorsement. Martha had registered all of this the way she registered most information about people she had not yet met, as data, as context, as the outline of someone she might eventually have occasion to deal with or might not. She had not thought about it beyond that. She met him for the first time on a Thursday in mid-June, when one of her mules got out through a gap in the fence she had not yet repaired. She had been working toward it from the south and hadn't gotten there, and wandered approximately 2 miles in the wrong direction before someone found it. That someone was Benjamin Sheridan. She heard the horse before she saw it, and came out of the house with her sleeves still rolled to her elbows and flour on her forearms from the bread she had been working, and she saw a man coming in from the road with her mule on a lead rope behind his horse. The man was not the sort of person who was easy to mistake for anyone else. He was tall in the saddle in a way that was not performative, not the tall of a man who knows he is tall and wants you to notice, just the natural vertical of a man who was made that way and had never thought much about it. His hat was worn at the brim from use, dark-banded, straight on his head. He wore a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his arms on the reins were the arms of a man who had done physical work for as long as Martha had done hers. He had a dark beard, kept short enough to be deliberate, and a face that weather had worked on without diminishing. He was, Martha noted with a clinical sort of honesty, not soft. He pulled up in her yard and looked down at her with eyes that were a specific shade of brown that she would have described, if pressed and in private, as warm, and then she would have noted the observation and moved on because she was a practical woman. "Found your mule about 2 miles north," he said, "near my south fence line. Figured he belonged somewhere and came looking." "He does belong somewhere," Martha said. "He belongs here. Thank you for bringing him back." "Benjamin Sheridan," he said, and reached down and offered her his hand without a moment's hesitation, which was not the common courtesy of a man who was used to not shaking women's hands. It was the common courtesy of a man who shook the hand of anyone worth his time regardless of what they looked like. Martha reached up and took it. His grip was firm without being performative, his palm rough with the same kind of history hers was, and they shook once, clean and equal, and released. "Martha Wells," she said, "I'm on the old Hatcher property." "I know," he said. "You've been busy out here." She looked at him without particular expression. "How would you know that?" "I can see your fencing from my north pasture when I ride that line," he said, without apology or embarrassment. "You've done good work on it." Martha received this assessment with the quiet satisfaction of someone who does not need compliments to feel secure, but is capable of appreciating accurate observation. "I have a gap another 1/4 mile north that I haven't gotten to yet," she said. "That is how your errand today happened. I apologize for the inconvenience." "It wasn't an inconvenience," he said, and handed her the mule's lead rope. His eyes moved briefly and without any particular intention to the flour on her forearms and then back to her face. "If you need any help with that fence section, I've got a hand who's good with wire." "I am also good with wire," Martha said pleasantly. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite classify, something between assessment and the beginning of a smile that hadn't decided whether to arrive yet. "I expect you are," he said. Then he nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and rode out the way he came. Martha watched him go for approximately 3 seconds, then tied her mule to the fence post and went back inside to finish her bread. She patched the fence gap the following morning. She saw Benjamin Sheridan again 2 weeks later at Calico Creek, which was not unusual. She went into town every week or 10 days for supplies, and he came in for various ranch business on a similarly regular schedule, and the town was not large enough for people to miss each other reliably. She was loading her wagon outside Prute's store when he came out of the land office across the street, folding a paper and tucking it into his shirt pocket, and he saw her and crossed over. "Mrs. Wells," he said, "Mr. Sheridan." He helped her lift a sack of cornmeal that was at the edge of the wagon and needed positioning without being asked to, and without making a particular moment of it, just a practical observation of something that needed two pairs of hands and a willingness to act on that observation. Martha accepted the help without protest and without excessive gratitude, because both extremes would have been dishonest. She could have managed it herself. It was simply easier this way, and two people being practical about a practical thing was not a statement about anything. "How's the wheat coming?" he asked. "It's coming," she said, slowly. "Hector Rios told me there's a hardpan issue in the south section that I need to address before the next planting." He would know, Benjamin said. He had picked up a piece of the harness on her near mule and was examining it with the unself-conscious attention of a man who could not help checking on animals and equipment when he was near them. "This stitching is going," he said, and held it out so she could see. Martha examined it. He was right. "I will deal with that tonight," she said. "I have a spare piece at the ranch. You're welcome to it." He said it the same way he'd offered the fence help, casually, without loading the gesture with anything it didn't need to contain. "I appreciate that," she said. "I'll manage with what I have for now, but I appreciate the offer." He nodded. She finished loading. He stood for a moment in the way of a man who had something else to say and was considering whether to say it, and then he said it. "A group of us are branding at my place Saturday. If you have any stock that needs done, you're welcome to bring them in. It's faster when the fire is already going." Martha had 11 head of cattle she had purchased in the spring, and she had been thinking about branding for 2 weeks without having arrived at a practical solution for doing it alone. "That is a genuine offer," she said. It was not a question exactly. "Genuine offer," he confirmed. "Then I accept," she said. "Thank you. Saturday morning early," he said. "Sunup." She was there at sunup with her 11 cattle on a lead and a halter, and Benjamin Sheridan was already at the fire when she arrived, working alongside 4 of his hands with the focused, easy authority of a man who was entirely comfortable being in charge without needing to make theater of it. He saw her come in, nodded, directed one of his men to open the pen, and they got to work. That was the first time she watched him work, which is different from the first time you see a person. Watching someone work tells you more about who they are than almost any other form of observation, because work is where pretense becomes expensive, and most people abandon it. Benjamin Sheridan worked with his whole body and his full attention, and he was good at what he did in the particular way that people are good at things they love, not with showiness, but with a kind of conversation between themselves and the task. A dialogue of small adjustments and responsive movements that looked, from the outside, almost like ease even when Martha could see it was not easy at all. He was also patient with his men in the way that she respected most, which was the way of a man who had standards and held to them, but knew that setting a man straight and making him feel small were not the same thing, and were not equally useful. Martha worked alongside them all day, and no one treated her differently for being a woman because Benjamin Sheridan did not, and his men took their cues from him. At midday his cook brought food out to the yard, and everyone ate together on the fence rails and on the ground, and it was the first time Martha had eaten a meal in the company of other people since leaving Abilene, and she noted, privately, that it was pleasant. Benjamin sat down on the fence rail beside her, which she noticed without reacting to. He ate with the same undistracted attention he gave to work. "How long were you in Kansas?" he asked. He said it the way you say something when you already know one version of the answer and are interested in the fuller one. 12 years, she said. "My whole marriage and the years after." He did not offer condolences or platitudes. He said, "What brought you to the Panhandle specifically?" "Land price," she said, which was true, and then after a brief deliberation added, "and the sky." He looked up at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary over the plains in the way the Panhandle sky frequently did, enormous and theatrical and entirely indifferent to any individual watching it. "Yes," he said, with a certainty that told her he understood exactly what she meant. They talked for the remainder of the lunch break with the comfortable rhythm of two people who are accustomed to directness and find in each other a relief from the social performance of people who are not. He told her about the ranch, about his father who had built it and who had died of a stroke 7 years past, about the drought of 1875 that had nearly finished what the estate taxes had started. He told it simply, without drama, without self-pity. She told him about Daniel and Clara, still in Abilene with her sister, about her plan to bring them down by August if the house was ready, about the school situation in Calico Creek, which was inadequate by any measure but was at least a school. "Miss Hollis runs it," he said. "She's a good woman. Not enough books, but she makes up for it." "I am bringing books," Martha said. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she was beginning to identify as a specific combination of genuine interest and something she could not quite name yet, but that made the back of her neck feel different. "Of course you are," he said. The branding finished by late afternoon, and Martha drove her 11 cattle home under a sky turning pink and gold along the western horizon, and she spent most of the drive home being honest with herself, which was the only way she knew how to spend private time. She was interested in Benjamin Sheridan. She acknowledged this. She had no particular plan to do anything about it. She was not here for that. She had children coming, a farm to build, a life to construct from the materials she had available, and she was not in the habit of wanting things she had not made room for. But she was interested. July came with heat that was almost a physical presence, something you moved through rather than simply stood in, and Martha did not slow down for it because she had not moved to Texas to be slowed by weather. She finished the interior of the house properly plastered dry and whitewashed, the floors swept and laid with the 2 rugs she had brought from Kansas, curtains at the windows because she was a woman of practical aesthetics, not just practicalities. She planted a kitchen garden. She fixed the barn roof. She ordered a second-hand school reader from the catalog at Pruitt's store for Daniel and 2 storybooks for Clara, because children need stories the way they need bread, and Martha Wells knew this even when she was tired. She and Benjamin Sheridan began to develop a casual pattern of contact that was not designed by either of them, but that grew from the proximity of working lands and shared road, the way such things grow in rural places. He stopped when he was riding his north line and saw her working the fence. She stopped at his gate once when she saw one of his stock had gotten twisted in some wire, because she could not have ridden past that and been herself. They met at church on Sundays, not every Sunday, because not every Sunday was a church Sunday for either of them, but enough Sundays to have exchanged more than 100 careful, honest words between them. She noticed he was unfailingly courteous to every person who crossed his path without distinction of status or character, that he was the sort of man who remembered the names of children and used them, that he had a quiet laugh that came infrequently and was therefore worth hearing when it did. She noticed that he looked at her the way she imagined she looked at a good problem with focused interest, with the patience of someone who expected the thing to yield eventually, but was in no particular hurry. She did not yet know what to do with any of this noticing. August arrived, and with it, Daniel and Clara on the stage from Abilene, hot and dusty and tired and brilliant with the energy of children who have been sitting still for 3 days and have opinions about everything. Martha met them at the stage stop and held them both so hard that Clara laughed and said, "Mama, you are squeezing," and Martha said, "I know," and did not stop. They were everything. They were the reason the fences were mended and the roof was fixed and the floors were swept. They were 12 and 10 and astonishing, and Martha drove them home through the wide Texas afternoon with her daughter asleep against her shoulder and her son asking 17 questions per mile about the land and the cattle and the sky, and she answered every one of them. She introduced them to her neighbors gradually, as the first weeks of the school year established the rhythms of their new life. She introduced them to Hector Rios, who gave Clara a baby goat to name, which Clara named Clover, and which thereafter complicated the goat-keeping question considerably. She introduced them to the Garfield family, who were kind and patient with children in the stoic way of people who have raised some of their own. And on a Sunday in late August, after church, she introduced them to Benjamin Sheridan. He was talking to the minister on the steps of the leaning church when Martha came out with a child on each side of her, and he looked up and saw her and finished his conversation and came over. He looked at Daniel first, then Clara, then at Martha, with an expression that was briefly unguarded in a way that she catalogued without knowing what category to put it in. He shook Daniel's hand seriously, as one man to another. He tipped his hat to Clara, which made Clara stand 2 inches taller. He said, "Your mother tells me you've been asking questions about ranching." This was addressed to Daniel, who nodded vigorously. "You're welcome to come out sometime and see how we do things," Benjamin said, "if your mother agrees." Martha, who had not told him Daniel was interested in ranching, looked at Benjamin with a particular attention. He met her eyes with an expression of absolute innocence that was just slightly too innocent to be accidental, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific warmth of someone doing something kind on purpose while pretending it was nothing. She looked away. The back of her neck was doing that thing again. "That is very kind," she said. Daniel went the following Saturday, and came home talking about horses and cattle and fence riding and proper rope, care with the evangelical intensity of a child who has discovered a vocation. And Martha listened to all of it patiently over the dinner table, and then listened to it again at breakfast on Sunday, and was quietly grateful in a way she could not have entirely articulated. September brought a specific kind of crisis that the Panhandle delivered periodically and without sentiment. A dry lightning storm that sparked a grass fire 3 miles north of Martha's property. She saw the smoke in the afternoon and knew before the first messenger arrived on horseback what it was. The fire was moving south with the wind, and by evening it was 1 mile north and the sky was orange, and there were 20 men riding the line between it and the properties in its path, and Benjamin Sheridan was leading them. Martha did not stay inside. She wet burlap sacks and tied her mules and Daniel firm, direct, no argument, and told Clara to stay in the house with the door closed, and went out to the fire line. Benjamin saw her coming and did not waste time telling her to go back. He handed her a wet burlap sack and pointed to the section of line he needed held, and she went and held it. They fought the fire through the night, 20 men and 1 woman beating the earth and the grass and the line between the burning and the living, and at 4 in the morning the wind shifted, and the fire went east away from the properties, and finally, 2 hours after that, it ran out of fuel in a section of overgrazed land and stopped. Martha sat on the ground in the gray pre-dawn and took a breath that tasted of smoke and dust, and the particular relief that follows genuine fear, and Benjamin sat down beside her on the ground with his hat off and his hair dark with sweat and his face striped with ash, and for a moment they simply sat there, side by side, breathing. "Your south pasture fence held," he said. "I know how to build a fence," she said. He made that sound, the quiet laugh, and she felt it in her chest. They sat in the gray dawn for another minute, and then he said, without looking at her, "You didn't have to come out." "Yes, I did," she said, and meant it with her whole body. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just understood something he had suspected for a while, and found the confirmation more significant than he had expected. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They rode back separately in the early morning light, and Martha put her mules away and checked her cattle, and found Clara still in the house where she had been told to stay, and Daniel asleep in the chair he had been sitting in while he waited up for her. And she covered him with her coat and went to bed for 3 hours and slept deeply and without dreaming. October in the Texas Panhandle was a kind of glory that the summer did not prepare you for. The sky dropped 2 shades bluer. The air thinned into something clear and dry and precise, and the light came at an angle that made even the plainest thing look like it was being deliberately illuminated. The wheat in Martha's south field had come in better than she had hoped, which meant the winter calculations were more comfortable, and she spent the first weeks of the month harvesting it with a rhythm that was satisfying and exhausting in equal measure. Benjamin came to help on the second day of harvest. He arrived before she had finished her breakfast, with two of his hands, and simply began. Martha came out of the house with coffee and found 3 men already working, and she stood for a moment looking at Benjamin Sheridan's back as he moved through her wheat field with a scythe, working with the quality of attention she had come to expect from him, which was total, which was unhurried, which was the attention of a man for whom work was itself a form of conversation with the world. She brought the coffee and distributed it and went back to get her own scythe, and she came out and worked beside them, and at some point during the long afternoon she and Benjamin ended up working the same section, side by side, in a rhythm that synchronized itself without any discussion, two people whose bodies understood the work and found an easy relation to each other within it. His hands on the scythe were like her hands on a scythe, economical, certain, making no wasted motion. She had noticed his hands the first day she met him, had noted their similarity to hers, their same accumulated language of physical life lived honestly. There was something in that recognition that she had been turning over in her mind for months without arriving at a conclusion about it. She arrived at one now, in the October wheat field, working beside him in the long afternoon light. She was in love with him. She acknowledged this with the same flat, practical honesty with which she acknowledged everything else. She was in love with Benjamin Sheridan. She had been falling there for months. From the first day, he had brought her mule back without condescension, without making her feel obligated, simply as one neighbor doing the obvious and decent thing for another. She had been falling there through Sundays and fire lines and harvests and the quiet conversations that happened on fence posts and wagon steps and church steps, and she had arrived. She was not afraid of it. She was not particularly delighted by it, in the way she might once have been delighted by love when she was younger and the world had felt like it had more softness available in it. She was simply honest about it. She loved him. She did not know what he felt. She did not intend to behave differently about it either way. She was 31 years old with 2 children and 40 acres, and a life she had built by hand, and she was not going to become a different kind of woman because she had feelings for someone. But she was honest about it. The harvest finished on the 3rd day, and she cooked a proper supper for everyone, including Benjamin's 2 hands who were both young men who ate with the focus of the perpetually hungry. She set the table with the good plates she had brought from Kansas, white with a blue rim, 3 chips between the full set, entirely presentable, and she made a rabbit stew with the dried herbs from her kitchen garden and cornbread that Clara had helped with, and they sat around the table, 8 people in a small house in the Texas Panhandle, and there was a fullness to the evening that Martha held in the back of her chest like something she did not entirely trust to be real yet. Benjamin stayed after his men left, helping clear the table without being asked, which was a small thing that Martha noted and filed in the growing category. She was building of small things that accumulated into a portrait of a particular kind of man. Daniel showed him the rope work he had been practicing, with the focused pride of a boy who wants the admiration of a specific adult and is not yet practiced at hiding it. Benjamin showed him a knot he didn't know yet, and they sat at the table together working the rope with their hands while Clara read aloud to no one in particular from her storybook, and Martha washed the dishes and listened to the sounds of her house, which felt, for the first time since she had come to Texas, like it was inhabited by what it was supposed to be inhabited by. Benjamin left at dusk. At the door he paused, his hat in his hands, and looked at her with an openness that was unusual for him, a slight lowering of the careful reserve that seemed to be his natural register, and he said, "Thank you for supper." "Thank you for the harvest," she said. Then, because she was an honest woman, she said, "It is good to have you here, Benjamin." It was the first time she had used his first name without the Mr. He received it with an expression that was brief and entirely eloquent. "It is good to be here," he said, He rode out into the dusk, and Martha stood in the doorway and watched him go, and did not pretend to herself that she was watching for any other reason than that she wanted to. November brought a visitor who was not welcome. His name was Franklin Cade, and he was a land speculator who operated out of Amarillo and who had been watching the properties along the northwest corridor of Palo Duro with the particular attention of a man who sees terrain primarily as opportunity. He arrived at Martha's gate on a gray morning in the first week of November in a good coat and a newer hat than anyone in Calico Creek typically wore, riding a horse that was too fine for the road he was traveling, and he smiled at Martha in a way that she recognized immediately and disliked immediately, the smile of a man who has decided in advance that you will be impressed by him. He had an offer for her land. He presented it with the professional smoothness of a man who made such presentations regularly, folding it into pleasantries and concern for her welfare and broad, unspecific suggestions that a woman alone out here, his words, might find it difficult in the coming winter, might find it easier too, and here was the offer, a number that was the exact amount she had paid for the land, which was to say it was an insult dressed as generosity. Martha looked at him from across her porch rail with an expression that she did not bother to soften. "The land is not for sale," she said. "Now, Mrs. Wells, I understand that it can be difficult to—" "The land is not for sale," she said again. "That is a complete sentence. It does not require qualification, and it is not an opening position in a negotiation. Good day, Mr. Cade." Franklin Cade spent another 3 minutes employing various approaches to the same conversation, and Martha spent those 3 minutes being politely, absolutely, immovably clear, and eventually he left, still smiling, which was the part that concerned her. A man who leaves smiling when he has not gotten what he came for is either gracious or planning. She did not believe Franklin Cade was gracious. She mentioned it to Benjamin the following Sunday after church. She told it straight as she always told things and watched his face go through a careful sequence of responses as he listened. When she finished, he said, "Cade has been working his way through this corridor for 2 years. He's gotten 4 parcels, 2 of them from families who had bad seasons and needed the money, the other 2 from people who got tired of being asked." "He will not get tired out with me," Martha said. "I know that," Benjamin said. It came out with a certainty that was not flattery, just accurate observation of the woman in front of him, and Martha received it as such. "Is there a legal issue I should be aware of? With my deed?" "Your deed is clean. I had Josiah confirm the records at the land office months ago." He stopped, and there was a beat of something between them, because he had just revealed that he had done this thing quietly on her behalf, without telling her, without making it a favor she was required to receive or respond to. He had simply done it because it needed doing and he was in a position to do it. His expression suggested he was aware of exactly how this revelation had landed. Martha looked at him for a long moment. "You did that without telling me," she said. "I did," he said. "I was not trying to manage your business. I had reason to be at the land office and I had the question in my head and I answered it while I was there. And you kept it to yourself until it was relevant," she said. "Yes." Martha was quiet for a moment, working through how she felt about this, which was a process she undertook seriously whenever her feelings were more complicated than expected. She was not angry. She was not even particularly unsettled. She was, she found, moved by it in the precise way she was moved by practical care, by the specific value of someone who did a thing quietly because the thing needed doing, without requiring recognition for it. That was the language she understood. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then, with the care of a man placing something down gently, he said, "Martha, I would like to talk to you about something that is not a fence or a fire or a land deed, if you are amenable to that." The November sky was enormous over them, the church steps warm with weak sunlight, and Martha Wells, who had spent 31 years being amenable to things that needed doing and considerably less time being amenable to things that she wanted, said, "Yes." They walked. The town of Calico Creek was small enough that walking its edges and the road that ran out from it took 20 minutes at a casual pace. And they walked it at a casual pace, while Daniel and Clara were inside the church at the post-service social that Miss Holly's organized for the children, and they talked. Benjamin said what he had been building toward for months with the directness she had come to expect from him, that he had been thinking about her in a way that had started as respect and had grown into something he did not want to keep managing at the level of polite neighborliness, that he was not asking her to change anything about her life, that he was asking her to consider whether there was room for him in it as something more than a neighbor. He said it looking at her directly with his hat in his hands, and she noticed his hands as she always noticed his hands, the thick, honest calluses on his palms, the evidence of a life built by work. And she thought of what she had told herself months ago in the private architecture of her own convictions. I have earned every callus on my hands, and I am not looking for soft. I need what I need, and I have learned to provide it for myself. She had said that to herself. She had meant it. She had also been wrong about one thing, which was the assumption that needing someone was the same as being soft, or that the thing she was missing was softness specifically. Benjamin Sheridan was not soft. He had never been soft. Not a single day of his life had made him soft, and not a single thing he had ever said or done in her company had been soft. He was exactly what she knew how to recognize. Someone whose hands told the truth, someone whose work was honest, someone who showed up at fire lines and harvest days and fence posts, and did what needed doing without drama and without requiring a performance of gratitude from anyone. He was not soft. He was strong and still and reliable, and he looked at her like she was worth looking at, and that was the thing she had been not looking for that had apparently arrived anyway. I have not been in a place to consider this until recently, she said, and I want to be honest with you about why. I know why, he said. You built something here first. You would not have been capable of it the other way around, and I was not about to rush something you needed to do at your own pace. She looked at him. You have been patient, she said. I have had reason to be patient, he said. She reached out and took his hand, right there on the road at the edge of Calico Creek, and held it in both of hers, looking at it, looking at the lines and the calluses and the evidence of him, and then looked up at him and said, I'm not easy to share a life with. I have opinions and I work hard and I do not defer, and I have 2 children who come before everything else. I know all of that, he said. I have known that since the first Sunday. And you are here anyway. I am here anyway. She held his hand for another moment, and then she let it go because they were on a public road, and she was a woman of propriety on public roads, and she said, Then let us see. And that was the beginning of it being official, which is different from the beginning of it existing, because it had been existing for a long time by then. December came, and with it the first real cold of the winter, the kind of cold the Panhandle delivered with specificity, not the damp cold of Kansas that settled into your bones, but a dry, bright, cutting cold that made the air smell like iron and the ground ring under your boots. Martha and Benjamin saw each other more intentionally now, which meant deliberate visits rather than casual ones, suppers at her house and one Sunday dinner at his, which was larger than hers and somewhat more spare, a bachelor's house that was clean and functional and missing the particular warmth of someone who had thought about where things should go. Martha noticed this the first time she walked through it and said nothing about it, because she had not been asked. Benjamin noticed her noticing and said, It has been functional, that is the best I can say for it. It is a good house, she said honestly. The bones are good. The bones are very good, he agreed. My father built it well. They stood in the front room of his house on a cold December afternoon, and there was a quality to that moment, a quality of 2 people measuring something silently and arriving at similar numbers, that Martha felt clearly and steadily and without anxiety. She was done being anxious about things she wanted. She was 31 years old, and she had earned the right to want things straightforwardly. Franklin Cade came back in December, which she had expected. He came with a different approach. Not the direct offer this time, but a series of small pressures delivered through intermediaries and implications. Someone mentioned to her at the store that there had been questions raised about her water rights, which when she looked into them were entirely unfounded, but had required a trip to Amarillo. A fence post on her eastern boundary was found cut, the wire clean cut, not broken by an animal, and she repaired it and said nothing publicly but told Benjamin, who looked at the cut wire with an expression that was careful and contained, and said that he would look into it. She did not ask him what looking into it meant. She trusted his methods because she had observed them, and his methods were always proportionate and never reckless. What happened was simpler than anyone expected. Benjamin Sheridan rode to Amarillo and had a conversation with 3 men who all knew Franklin Cade, and several of whom had legal opinions about his business practices that would have been expensive for Cade to argue with. He had the conversation quietly and returned and told Martha that she should not expect further visits from Franklin Cade. She raised an eyebrow. "That is very efficient," she said. "Cade is a man who responds to clear communication about consequences," Benjamin said. "Once he understands that the land is not available and that pressing the matter will create problems for him that outweigh any possible value of the property, he will find other interests." "And you made that clear," she said. "Completely," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to be clear that I do not need protecting," she said. "I know that," he said. "I was not protecting you. I was removing a specific practical obstacle from both our paths because I have an interest in this land staying in your hands and because I was in a position to do it efficiently. That is all." She thought about this carefully. "That is a meaningful distinction," she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought it would be." She did not hear from Franklin Cade again. His operation moved west toward New Mexico territory that winter, and he did not return to the Palo Duro corridor. And the land Martha Wells had bought and repaired and planted and fenced and made into something real remained entirely, incontrovertibly hers. Christmas in Calico Creek was an earnest affair, the town making up in effort what it lacked in resources. The church was decorated with cut juniper and ribbon, and Miss Hollies organized the children into a program that involved a considerable quantity of off-key singing, and one small miracle of actual talent from a boy named Pete Garfield who turned out to have a voice like clear water. Martha made pies, 2 pecan, 1 dried apple, and brought them to the community table, and watched her children in the warm light of the church hall and felt a specific and full contentment. Benjamin sat beside her through the program. He had brought ribbon candy from Amarillo specifically because Clara had mentioned it in passing 3 weeks ago, and he had remembered it. And the look on Clara's face when he produced it was something Martha stored in the private archive of moments she intended to keep. Daniel was beside him learning to do the rope knot again, with a length of cord Benjamin had brought in his pocket for precisely this purpose. And there was something in the sight of them, the man and her son bent together over the cord in the candlelight, that reached somewhere deep in Martha and settled there like something that had been looking for a place to land. After the program was over and the children were in a group of their own and the adults were gathered around the food and the warmth, Benjamin said to her quietly, "I have been thinking about asking you to marry me." She looked at him with the full attention she brought to everything. "You have been thinking about it," she said. "Not doing it. I am aware of the order of the steps," he said. "I am telling you that I have been thinking about it so that you are not surprised when I do it, and so that you have time to form an opinion before I do, which will make the conversation more efficient." Martha felt the warmth move through her chest with a steadiness that was different from the nervous heat of young love, different from the anxious wanting of someone who is not sure she is going to get a thing. It was the warmth of someone who already has a thing and is being asked if she wants to make it formal. "That is very practical of you," she said. "I am a practical man." "You are," she said. "And I am a practical woman. So I will tell you in advance of the official asking that my answer is yes. If the question is yes, the answer is yes." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before, not the quiet laugh, not the careful assessment, not the open warmth of a Sunday afternoon. This was something quieter and deeper than any of those, the expression of a man who has been working toward something important for a long time and has arrived and found it better than expected. He reached over and took her hand under the table in the warm noise of the church hall and held it. "Then I will make it official soon," he said. He did. He came to her house on New Year's Day, 1879, dressed as carefully as he dressed for anything that mattered to him which was not elaborate, because he was not an elaborate man, but clean and deliberate. And he asked her on her own porch in the cold, bright January morning with his hat in his hands and his eyes on hers, directly, without performance, the way he did everything. He asked if she would marry him. He asked knowing she was not someone who needed saving and not trying to save her. He asked knowing she had built what she had built by herself and wanting to build beside her, not for her. He asked, as she would say to Clara years later, like a man asking an equal. She said yes. She said it plainly, looking at him, meaning it with everything she had. Daniel was listening from inside the house, which they both knew. Clara was pretending to read on the window seat, which they also both knew. When Martha said yes and Benjamin put a ring on her finger, a simple silver band that had been his mother's, plain and strong, there was a sound from inside the house that was Daniel trying and failing to be quiet about his enthusiasm. And Martha laughed a real laugh, full and warm, the laugh of a woman who has not been surprised by happiness in a long time and finds it more extraordinary for that. They married in March of 1879 in the Leaning Church in Calico Creek, on a Saturday when the plains were beginning to green with the first pale color of spring. Miss Hollies and the Garfields were there. Hector Rios was there, wearing a coat that was clearly his best and looking at the proceedings with the quiet satisfaction of a man who approves of the outcome. Josiah Prout was there, because he was always present when something notable occurred in Calico Creek, and would describe the event to subsequent visitors in the store with the authority of a man who had been at the center of it rather than the periphery. But he meant well. Martha wore a dress that was dark blue because she was a woman who knew what colors worked on her, and was not going to be married in white simply because convention recommended it. She had made it herself, in the evenings through February, with good fabric from Prout's store and her careful, capable hands. Benjamin wore his best shirt, clean-shaved, and looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that she would remember specifically for the rest of her life, the expression of a man for whom the real thing has arrived and is exactly what he hoped for and more than he expected. The minister performed the ceremony with the straightforward warmth of a man who performed weddings in a frontier town and understood that the couple before him had made their decisions with their eyes fully open. Benjamin said his vows in his own voice, steady and direct. Martha said hers in hers, looking at him. When the minister pronounced them married, Clara said, "Finally," loudly enough for half the church to hear, and the laughter that followed them out into the March sunlight was the best kind, the warm, willing laughter of people who are genuinely happy for someone. The three of them, Martha, Benjamin, Daniel, and Clara, four moved to the ranch, which was larger and more established than the homestead, and Martha brought her household into it with the same deliberate, systematic energy she brought to everything. The ranch house changed. Not dramatically, not at the expense of what Benjamin had built, but it changed in the way that a house changes when someone who knows how to make a home steps into it and begins the process of making it so. The rugs from Kansas went on the floors. The white and blue plates went on the shelf. Books appeared. Herbs grew in the kitchen garden and dried in bundles from the ceiling. Benjamin watched all of this happen and did not comment on it, partly because he had no objection and partly because he found the watching itself to be something he had not expected to enjoy so much. The homestead, Martha's original 40 acres, They kept and worked as additional land for the operation. The wheat field became a reliable part of their annual production. Daniel, who turned 13 that spring, began learning the ranch in earnest under Benjamin's guidance, and there was something in the way that relationship developed that Martha watched with the full weight of her attention. Benjamin treated Daniel with the exact combination of seriousness and patience that boys need, taking his questions seriously, correcting his errors without humiliation, expecting him to work alongside the men and to be capable of it, and gradually allowing him to demonstrate that he was. Daniel, who had grown up with a good father who had been limited by illness and circumstance, blossomed in this specific kind of directed attention, and Martha felt the gratitude of this in a place she could not have described precisely, but which was central. Clara remained Clara, fierce, curious, opinionated, and in permanent possession of her own agenda. She adored Clover the goat with the loyalty of someone who had made a specific commitment and intended to honor it. She read everything she could put her hands on. She argued with anyone who would argue and some who would not. Benjamin treated her arguments as seriously as he treated anything, which meant that sometimes she won them, which Clara found intoxicating, and which Martha found occasionally exhausting and entirely correct. The spring of 1879 was good. The summer was hard, a drought that tested the water situation on all the properties in the region, requiring careful management of the stock and more than one difficult decision about numbers. Martha and Benjamin made those decisions together at the kitchen table, with maps and numbers between them and the same directness they brought to every conversation. There were disagreements. There were two genuine arguments, one about water allocation and one about money, and both of them argued with their full investment because that was the only way either of them knew how to argue about things that mattered, and both arguments ended in the same place. In the honesty of two people who respected each other too much to let the disagreement rest without resolution, who understood that the working through was part of the commitment. After the water argument, which had lasted most of an evening and had involved several points of genuine technical disagreement and some moments of heat on both sides, they sat at the table in the late-night quiet, and Benjamin said, "You were right about the south pasture allocation." "You were right about the timing," Martha said. "We were both right about different parts," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is how it usually is." He looked at her with the warmth that was, by now, as familiar to her as the weight of her own hands. "I like this," he said, and meant all of it, the argument, the resolution, the specific texture of sharing a life with someone who did not need him to be right every time and did not need to be agreed with every time. "So do I," she said, and meant the same. The summer drought broke in September, and the relief of that was felt in every corner of the region as a collective exhale. The fall was a recovery, restocking, replanting, repairing what the dry summer had damaged. Martha and Benjamin worked side by side through it with the practiced efficiency of two people whose bodies had learned each other's rhythm, and there was a pleasure in that physical collaboration, in the wordless communication of people who have been working together long enough to anticipate each other. That was its own kind of intimacy. By October, Martha knew she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper, when Daniel was doing his figures at the table and Clara had gone to bed with a book. She told him in the same way she told him everything, plainly, looking at him. His face moved through several things in quick succession, and then arrived at something wide and still and entirely unprepared, the face of a man confronted with joy he had not let himself fully anticipate. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing that came to him, and which was so entirely characteristic of him that she loved him for it with a sudden, specific force. "I am very well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Daniel, bent over his figures, did not look up, but there was the slight quality of a child who is pretending harder than usual to not be listening. Benjamin looked at Martha's hand in his, at the ring on her finger, at the hands themselves, both their hands together, both pairs of working hands, calloused and capable and strong, and he said, "Thank you," She pressed his hand. "We did that together," she said. Daniel looked up then with the expression of a 12-year-old who has been listening and has now calculated what is being said and is experiencing a complex mixture of feelings about it. "Are you going to tell us officially?" he asked. Martha looked at him with the full warmth of her whole heart. "We are going to have a baby," she said, "in the spring." Daniel was quiet for a moment, working through it. Then he said, in the careful voice of a boy trying to be mature about something that was making him emotional, "Clara is going to have opinions about this." "Clara," Martha said, "has opinions about everything." Clara, it turned out, had been awake and listening, and had heard all of it through the bedroom wall, and she appeared in the doorway with her book pressed to her chest, and an expression that was enormous and unguarded and completely undone with happiness. She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her arms around Martha's neck, hard, in the way Clara did everything, and said nothing at all, which was how Martha knew it was real. Benjamin, watching this from across the table, looked like a man who has arrived somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward, and found it to be exactly right. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the warmest and the most interior season of Martha's life since before Robert Wells died, which is not to say there was no cold. There was cold. There was always Panhandle cold, but the interior of the ranch house was warm with food and people, and the specific quality of a household that knows what it has and tends it carefully. Hector Rios came for Christmas and brought a cured ham, and told a story about the year he had spent in Chihuahua that lasted 3 hours and improved with every telling. The Garfields came on Christmas Eve with a pie and their usual quiet benevolence. Miss Hollies came for New Year's dinner and sat with Martha for 2 hours talking about books after the children were in bed, which was the kind of evening Martha had not had in years. Benjamin watched Martha through all of it, not with surveillance, not with the anxious hovering of a man who has decided he is managing something fragile, but with the particular attention of a man who finds the thing he loves most interesting when it is doing the thing it does best, which in Martha's case was existing fully and without apology in the life she had made. He said to her once, late in the winter, lying in the dark of their bedroom with the cold outside the walls and the warmth inside it, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "When I first rode into your yard with that mule," he said, "I had been looking at your fence work for 2 weeks and I already had a strong opinion about you." "A strong opinion," she said. "I thought you were the most serious person I had ever considered," he said. "I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give, serious in the way that the land is serious, in the way that work is serious when it matters." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were not soft," she said. "And I was relieved by that." "You had decided you did not want soft," he said. "I had decided I could not use soft," she said, with the precision of someone making a distinction. "And I had stopped looking for what I could actually use because I had stopped believing I was allowed to look for it." She paused. "And then there you were on a horse with my mule and you were not soft at all and you shook my hand like I was a person and I thought, this is a man who understands the same things I understand." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You did not let yourself want it for a long time." "No," she said, "I did not." "I am glad you let yourself eventually," he said. She found his hand in the dark. "So am I," she said. Their son was born in April of 1880 on a clear night after a day of rain that left the air clean and the grass luminous. He was large and healthy and loud about his opinions, and he had a full head of dark hair, and as Clara immediately pointed out, Benjamin's ears. They named him James Robert Sheridan, James for Benjamin's father, Robert for Martha's husband, the man who had been the children's father and who deserved to be remembered by name in this new life. Martha had said she wanted that, and Benjamin had said, without hesitation, yes. James was an uncomplicated baby in the way that second or third or fourth children, depending on how you counted Martha's experience with 2 already raised, tend to be uncomplicated, at least initially. He ate and slept and grew with the single-minded efficiency of a person with a clear agenda, and Martha handled this with the experience of someone who had done it before, and the stamina of someone who did not slow down for things that were manageable. Daniel was fascinated by him with the earnest interest of a boy who had never been around a newborn, and found it to be a more complicated situation than he had anticipated. Clara was in charge of him approximately 40% of the time, by her own assessment, and was confident that she was the reason he was thriving. Benjamin held his son with the care of a man who has handled horses and cattle and rope and iron his whole life, and is now confronted with something that requires a different and more deliberate kind of strength. The care of holding something that must be held gently without being held breakably. Martha watched him figure it out over the first weeks, the gradual ease of it, the way James relaxed in his arms once Benjamin had stopped being afraid of him, and she thought it was one of the more beautiful things she had ever watched happen. The spring of 1880 settled into summer, and then into fall with the particular rhythm of a well-ordered working life, which is to say with constant motion, with challenge and resolution, with small crises managed and large projects undertaken, and the slow satisfaction of watching things you have planted grow into something. The ranch expanded its cattle operation by 200 head over the summer, a calculated risk that paid off. The homestead fields produced a stronger wheat crop than the previous year. Daniel turned 15 and was riding fence line with the older hands and doing it well. Clara turned 13 and was reading every book Miss Hollis owned and half of what Martha had brought from Kansas and demanding more. Hector Rios came one afternoon in September with a specific look on his face, the look of a man who has news that is not entirely his own and is handling it carefully, and sat at Martha's kitchen table and told her that the Garfield family was leaving. The older Garfields, the parents, were going to California to their daughter's family, and the son was selling the property. He told her this gently because he knew she valued them, and because transitions in small communities were felt in specific ways. Martha was quiet for a moment. "I hope they find what they are going toward," she said, which was what she genuinely felt. Then she said, "Will you be all right?" Hector looked at her with the expression of a man who has been asked this question and is taking it seriously. "I am thinking," he said, "about whether I want to go to my family in San Antonio for a while. My sister has been asking." "And," Martha said. "And I am old," Hector said, "and the winters are getting long." He looked at her directly. "If I go, I will give you the right of first purchase on my land." Martha looked at him. "You have not decided yet," she said. "No," he said, "but I am telling you the terms in advance so that you have time to think." Martha reached across the table and touched the back of his hand briefly, which for both of them was a significant gesture. "Thank you, Hector," she said. "Take your time. We will be here." He did decide, eventually, not that winter but the following spring in 1881, when the weather broke early and his sister's letters became more specific, and the pull of family and warmer winters became more than the pull of familiar land. He came to tell them on a March morning, and he and Martha shook hands on the purchase of his property at a fair price, and he stayed for dinner, and there was a quality to that evening of ending and beginning and gratitude for the person who had been a neighbor, and who had taught her where the hardpan ran, and who had given Clara a goat she still kept, that Martha held carefully. The summer of 1881 was fine. James was 14 months old and walking with the slightly dangerous enthusiasm of a child who has only recently discovered bipedalism and has unlimited confidence in it. Clara had started helping Miss Hollis with the younger students 3 afternoons a week, a development that had surprised everyone except Martha, who had seen it coming for a year. Daniel was 16 and riding with the men full days without distinction, which was what he had wanted and had worked toward, and watching the young man he was becoming, straight-backed and careful and decent in the way Benjamin was decent, was one of the ongoing private joys of Martha's daily life. She and Benjamin had settled into something that was better than the early months, better even than the good early months. They had settled into the specific ease of two people who have learned to trust each other not just with their good moments, but with their tired ones, their difficult ones, the evenings when the work had been too much and patience was thin, and neither of them was at their best. They had argued more over the years and resolved things more, and each resolution had added another layer to the foundation of something that was not dramatic or theatrical, but was entirely and permanently solid. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1881, Martha was sitting on the porch with James asleep in her lap and a book open but unread on the rail beside her. And the plains were doing what they did in October, that specific blue light at an angle, the grass brown and gold, the sky so vast you could feel the curvature of the earth if you let yourself, and Benjamin came and sat beside her, and they were quiet together for a while. He said, "Are you happy?" She turned to look at him, and she thought about the 40 acres she had driven into alone in the spring of 1878, and the house she had replastered, and the fence she had repaired, and the wheat she had planted, and all the work she had done before she had any reason to believe there was anything at the end of it beyond the work itself. She thought about her hands on the reins of her wagon and her hands on the fence wire and her hands on the scythe, and about the moment she had looked at his hands and understood what she was recognizing. She thought about James's weight in her lap and Clara's voice inside the house reading something aloud to herself, and Daniel at the barn and the full particular smell of the ranch in October, and the man beside her who was not soft, who had never been soft, who had shown her that consistently every day since the first day, and who had been worth every day of the quiet, careful, honest falling. "Yes," she said. It was a complete sentence and it needed no qualification. "I am happy." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch in the October afternoon with their sleeping son between them and the enormous Panhandle sky above them and the life they had built by hand around them, and it was entirely, sufficiently, perfectly enough. But the story does not end there, because lives do not end at their best moments. They continue through them and beyond them, and the continuing is itself the story. Martha was pregnant again by Christmas of 1881, which she told Benjamin on the same evening she was certain, in the same direct way she told him everything. He received it with the same expression he had received it the first time, that wide-open expression of unprepared joy, and then he laughed a real laugh, open and full, not the quiet one she was used to, and she laughed too, and James, woken by the laughter, sat up from his pallet and looked at them with the solemn bafflement of a 19-month-old confronted with incomprehensible adult behavior. "Again," Daniel said from across the room, in the carefully neutral voice of a 16-year-old trying very hard not to have any feelings about this. "Again," Martha confirmed. Clara made a sound of pure satisfaction that contained approximately 14 opinions, which she then delivered over the course of the following hour. The second child was a daughter, born in July of 1882, in the heat of the summer, which Martha endured with the stoic adaptability she brought to all conditions. They named her Ruth Elizabeth Sheridan, Elizabeth for Martha's mother, and Ruth because it was strong and old, and suited the kind of person they suspected she was going to be, which turned out to be entirely accurate. Ruth arrived with considerably less noise than James had, but with an intensity of attention that made her seem, from the first days, like a person who was gathering information she intended to use. Daniel was 17 when Ruth was born, and he was already talking about the possibility of managing a section of the expanded Sheridan operation on his own, which he had earned the right to talk about. Benjamin had conversations with him about it with the seriousness the subject deserved, and Martha watched her son talk to her husband about land and cattle and the future of something they had all built together, and she had to occasionally look at the middle distance and breathe slowly, because the fullness of it was almost more than she could carry without spilling. In the fall of 1882, two things happened that settled the remaining threads of the life they had built. The first was that Benjamin formalized Daniel and Clara's position in his will and in the ranch records as partial heirs, alongside James and Ruth. He did this without announcement, without ceremony. He simply had the legal papers drawn up in Amarillo and brought them home and showed Martha and said, "They are ours. That is how it should be recorded." Martha read the document carefully because she read everything carefully. Then she set it down and looked at him for a long moment. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I did it." She held his eyes for a long moment, and she could feel the weight of the years in the room, the accumulated evidence of who this man was, and she said quietly, "Benjamin." "Yes," he said, which answered whatever she had been about to say. The second thing was that Josiah Pruitt announced his retirement and the sale of the general store, and the buyer was no one from outside but Miss Holly's, who had saved her teaching salary for 11 years toward exactly this possibility, and who ran the store for the next 30 years and the school simultaneously, and was one of the most organized people in the Texas Panhandle for the duration. Calico Creek changed slowly over the following years, as towns grew some, lost some, shifted in character and population as the frontier consolidated itself into something that was neither entirely old nor entirely new. More families came in. A proper school building was constructed in 1884, which resolved the book problem substantially, partly because Martha donated 4 dozen books to it from her own collection, and partly because Miss Holt, who was Miss Holly's replacement when Miss Holly's moved to the store, had even stronger opinions about literature than her predecessor and acted on them firmly. The Sheridan Ranch grew steadily through the 1880s, not dramatically, not through acquisition or aggression, but through the patient accumulation of good decisions and sound management, and the specific advantage of two people who thought well together and worked hard together and told each other the truth. They hired fairly. They kept their hands through lean seasons when other ranches didn't, which meant that when good seasons returned, their people were still there, experienced and loyal. They dealt honestly with every person they bought from or sold to, which created the kind of reputation that does not make a man rich quickly, but makes him trusted permanently. Daniel married at 22, a girl named Sarah from a farming family near Amarillo, quiet and sensible, and with a capacity for physical work that Martha approved of immediately and heartily. They moved into the homestead, which Martha had held and kept in repair all those years against exactly this kind of future, and Daniel ran his section of the operation from there with a seriousness that was entirely his own, and also, unmistakably, his mother's and his father's in the ways that mattered. Clara, who had trained herself partly through Miss Holt and partly through her own relentless self-education, took a position teaching in Amarillo at 20, and then in a larger town outside Fort Worth at 23, and sent letters home that were extraordinary in their intelligence and humor and length, and that Martha read at the kitchen table and passed to Benjamin, and then kept in a box she labeled with Clara's name. Clara visited every year without fail. She never married, not because she could not, but because she did not want to, which Martha understood completely and said so, which made Clara, the first time her mother said it, go quiet for a moment, and then hug her in the way she had always hugged, hard and without reservation. James grew into the ranch the way he had been growing into everything since he started walking with absolute confidence, with Benjamin's quiet steadiness, and with enough of Martha's directness and practicality to make him formidable in any practical situation. By the time he was 16, he was riding as well as anyone on the property, and by 17, he was making management decisions that were sound. Ruth, as anticipated, was a force of nature. She turned 12 in 1894 and was already the best reader in the Calico Creek school by a substantial margin and had opinions about it that she shared freely. She was going to be, it was clear, something considerable, though what exactly would take a few more years to reveal itself. Martha turned 45 in the spring of 1892, on a morning that started early, as they all did, with the work of a ranch and a household, and the particular responsibility of people who have made something real and intend to keep it so. Benjamin was 47. They had been married 13 years, and the 13 years had not softened either of them, which was the way they both would have wanted it. What the years had done instead was deepen the conversation between them, deepen the honesty of it and the ease of it, and the specific pleasure of two people who have chosen each other every single day of those 13 years, and found the choice consistently right. On her birthday, which she did not make a particular occasion of, he left something on the kitchen table before she came downstairs, which she found with her first cup of coffee, a piece of good paper, folded twice, with her name on the outside in his handwriting. She opened it. Inside, in his careful, plain script, were 4 lines. "You have earned every callus on your hands, and they are the finest thing I have ever seen. You were not looking for soft, and I was not soft, and I have spent every day of knowing you being grateful for both of those things." It was not a poem. It was not flowery or elaborated or dressed in any language that was not entirely and completely Benjamin Sheridan's. Martha read it twice, standing in her kitchen in the early morning, and then folded it carefully and put it in the box with Clara's letters, because it deserved to be kept with the things she intended to keep forever. She went out to find him at the barn, where he was already working, and she went up beside him, and he looked at her, and she said nothing because she did not need to say anything. She took his hand and he held it, and they stood in the barn in the early morning with the light coming in sideways through the boards and the horses moving quietly in their stalls, and it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary, and it was everything. The years that followed moved with the quality of a life that is full and honest and fundamentally at peace with itself. There were hard seasons and good ones, losses that were felt. Hector Rios died in San Antonio in 1886, peacefully in his sister's house, and the letter that came told them he had spoken of Martha and the homestead in his last weeks, which she received with a grief that was quiet and complete. There were births. Daniel and Sarah had 3 children between 1888 and 1893, 2 boys and a girl, who were brought to the ranch regularly, and who understood that their grandmother Martha was a person of authority and affection in exactly equal measure. There were community events and droughts and good rains, and the slow transition of Calico Creek from a rough frontier town into something with more permanence, more structure, more of the ordinary civic life that frontier towns either grew into or didn't. Martha served on the school board from 1885 onward and argued, consistently, for better resources and better teacher pay and more books, and won most of those arguments over time because she was patient and she was right and she did not stop. Benjamin served 1 term as county magistrate in the early 1890s, reluctantly, at the request of several people he respected, and administered justice in the straightforward, consistent way of a man who believed the rules meant the same thing regardless of who was asking to be exempt from them. They grew older together at the pace of people who do not slow down willingly, who still woke before dawn and worked past dark when the work required it, who argued when they disagreed and resolved what needed resolving and went to bed in the same house every night of every year without exception. The calluses on Martha's hands never fully softened because she never stopped using them for the work they had always done. She thought sometimes, in the private architecture of her own mind, about the woman she had been when she drove into Calico Creek alone in the spring of 1878. That woman with her mules and her list and her conviction that softness was not what she was looking for and not what she needed. She had been right about that, as it turned out. Just wrong about one thing, which was the assumption that the opposite of soft was solitary. She had thought those were the same, and they were not. You could be strong and unbreakable and still be held. You could have hands that had earned every mark on them and still have someone else's hands beside yours. That was what Benjamin had understood from the beginning, or had at least been patient enough to offer her time to understand, which amounted to the same thing. Ruth turned 16 in 1898 and announced over dinner one evening that she intended to become a doctor, which was said in the calm, declarative tone of someone who has already decided and is now informing the relevant parties. The relevant parties, specifically her parents, received this with a brief silence that was not doubt but the natural pause of people taking the thing seriously, which was what Ruth deserved and what she had expected. "There are medical schools," Benjamin said, "in the East." "I know," Ruth said. "I have already written to 2 of them." Martha looked at her daughter, this force of nature who had been gathering information from the day she arrived, and she felt the complete and specific joy of watching a person become what they were made to be. "Then we will find a way," she said. And they did. Ruth Sheridan went east for her education in 1901, which was beyond the boundary of this particular story, but was the thing the story had been growing toward. The evidence that what Martha Wells had built by hand in 40 acres of Texas Panhandle in 1878 had become something that produced people who went out into the world equipped with everything it takes to do something in it. That was the measure of it, not the cattle or the land or the wheat, the people. On a spring morning in the first year of the new century, 1900, which arrived in Calico Creek with the same vast sky and the same flat light it had always had, unchanged, an enormous Martha stood at the window of the ranch house kitchen and watched Benjamin come in from the barn, the same walk she had been watching for 20 years, and felt the thing she always felt, which was not the heat of early love or the anxiety of early wanting, but something steadier and more essential. The specific, earned, unbreakable warmth of a life built on ground you stood in together. She heard him at the door, heard the familiar sounds of his arrival, hat on the hook, boots on the mat, and she poured 2 cups of coffee with the certainty of someone who knows exactly how long these motions take, and she turned from the window as he came into the kitchen. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the same warm, specific attention, the look of a man for whom the most interesting thing in the room has not changed in 20 years. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and handed him his coffee, and their hands touched at the exchange, her hand in his, both of them exactly as they had always been, rough and strong and honest and unmarked by anything except the life they had lived in them, fully and without apology together. The house was full of them, all the years of it, all the meals and arguments and harvests and births and losses and seasons of that specific Panhandle sky. The rugs from Kansas were on the floors still, worn soft in the center from 20 years of boots. The white and blue plates were on the shelf, more chipped now, all 5 still present, still entirely usable. There were more books than there had ever been. Clara's letters filled 2 boxes now. James's rope hung on the barn wall where he had left it the last time he was home. And on the porch, later that morning, in the particular April light that the Panhandle still delivered with the same extravagance it had always brought to the occasion, the bluing sky and the greening grass, and the air that was clean and thin and tasted of open distance. Martha Wells Sheridan sat beside her husband and held his hand, and they looked out at the land they had built on and built from and built into, and they were not soft, either of them. Not a single day of their lives had made them soft. And they were home.